When you think about exercise, first of all, where does it land on kind of the hierarchy of importance for you? And beyond that, what types of exercise do you guys focus on when it comes to health span and longevity and whatnot? And then we can kind of go from there.
So a lot of the patients that I see in the clinic, they are incredibly busy and often don't have time to go out to the gym. They're juggling one or two jobs just to make ends meet. They've got kids that they're looking after. So my role is to try and figure out how can we introduce some forms of exercise into those patients' lives, and making sure that these changes are going to be sustainable over the long term. And it can be as simple as things like, if you drive to work, parking 10 minutes away so that you can actually fit in some exercise into your day. Or another concept that I'm really interested in at the moment is this concept of exercise snacks. So, for example, in between patients, I'll do a set of push-ups to near failure, or I'll do, some wall sits, or a different type of exercise, and just trying to fit that in throughout the day. And I found that that approach has been quite useful for patients that I've seen at the clinic, because again, a lot of them are just so busy and don't have the time to dedicate, an hour a day into the gym. So I'm just curious about what you guys think about, yeah, the concept of exercise snacks, or how people can actually fit exercise into their day.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's important to realize that some exercise is better than none. And actually, probably you get the most the biggest difference in benefits from going from nothing to some than the incremental benefits that you get then increasing. So I would absolutely make sure that you get some exercise in there if you have a really busy life, even if it's 10 minutes a couple times a week. The biggest thing is going from none to some and doing it consistently, because we know how hard that is with the Western population, where people very often do no exercise at all. So I would, yeah, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? Don't be shooting for being a professional athlete if you do no or next to no exercise. Baby steps. Just make sure that you start doing something once or twice a week at first, 10 minutes. I would just add also the enjoyment factor. Find the type of exercise that you enjoy, because if it's a chore, if you dread swimming or running or whatever, lifting weights or whatever it is, you're probably not going to stick with it unless you are a particularly gung-ho person. But for most of us, it's really hard to do something uh, that we hate. So absolutely choose something that you have some level of enjoyment, or at least can do and not be a torture.
Yeah, a lot to cover there. So first off, Brad, your point about the exercise snacks, it's not an area that I've actually investigated a whole lot into, but I know that you've covered it in the past. I think it's a fantastic area of well, just where people should really pay attention. Just looking at just a few minutes throughout their day that they can do, physical activity, or if that's exercise specifically. The different modalities when it comes to exercise, the wall squats that Gilles and I have discussed in the past. I'm going to keep trying. Um, uh, I think that's one of, and actually, Brad, I think you've got a video on that as well, looking at that research. Um, and I think that that is just such a short thing that a person can do that has such tremendous impact. And also going to that kind of minimal amount of effort that a person could put in, and you can get a tremendous amount of benefit out of it as well. And it's true, it's just like basically anything, as far as I'm aware, in biology, you're going to have a law of diminishing returns. If you put in tons more effort into something, eventually you get to this point where you're putting in so much effort, but you're not getting that much more out of it. And of course, when it comes to exercise, well, I guess I won't muddy the waters by going into that territory. But the point being that if you can just do a minimal amount, 10 minutes. I think the ACSM, when I was in my exercise physiology degree, they were recommending 10 minutes was the minimum that a person should do. And I think that's pretty doable. 10 minutes, let's say, to your point about just doing it once a week, then try to do it twice a week, then try to do it 3 times a week. And once you hit that 3 times a week threshold, maybe try to hit 15 minutes on just one of those and then still do 10 minutes and just have these incremental increases in your ability to do this exercise. And I realize that for some people it's really difficult because of time. Some people it's because of their physical ability. Some people it's because of some sort of disease state that they're dealing with. I totally understand that, or their age. That can also be a factor. In terms of the types of exercises, you could do like the wall squats, which are like these static holds that have an effect on your blood pressure, your cardiovascular risk. You can also do just basic walks, if you can. And even if you can't walk, there are like hand ergometers and things of that nature that can be used if you have trouble, let's say, if you have a lot of trouble with your legs and you can't move very easily. And then you can, go from there. And of course, resistance training in some capacity. Again, doesn't have to be in the weight room, doesn't have to be with machines. It can be something extremely simple. A lot of that stuff can have pretty tremendous impact from that 10 minutes. And then if you can just go a little bit higher over time.
Yeah, I'll throw in some more quick actionable tips. So having a buddy, an accomplice, so a partner that you go to the gym with or whatever workout you're doing, you don't have to do it alone. If you have somebody that you go to the gym with or you play tennis with or whatever it is, that makes it easier because it's more fun, becomes a social activity, and you have someone to keep you accountable, right? So that's a good setup if you can. Joining a class is a good idea for the same reason. Like there's something that's happening that you have to go to. It's harder to ditch than if it's just you going to the gym to work out. Having challenges is really good because it makes it exciting. So I recently started this VO2 max challenge, just trying to, in my case, it was just walking a mile as fast as I could. And it sounds boring, but you start doing it and then timing it, and then you start trying to beat yourself. And I start, because we're all competitive, I start looking up ways to walk faster, and you're like trying to beat your time every day. So it becomes this exciting thing. And I go to the same place and I walk the mile. It becomes this challenge. Then you have like an Excel spreadsheet, and you're beating your record, your personal record every time. So these are types of things that are simple, but can turn something from a chore, something that you dread, to something that you are thinking about and almost anticipating doing. And then another thing that you touched on, that exercise doesn't have to be going to the gym and getting on the treadmill or something. Even non-exercise physical activity, whether it's gardening or gathering berries or doing home improvement, all these things that keep you active, that keep you moving your body, have benefits. There's actually studies looking at this non-exercise physical activity, even separate from exercise. Removing exercise from the equation still is associated with the health benefits, substantial health benefits. So yeah, it's all part of this constellation of staying active and staying mobile and using our bodies.
Gil, just to pick up on one thing that you've mentioned, so you used the example of tennis, and I actually think that tennis is a really powerful exercise for a number of different reasons. So it's typically social, right? So you're doing it with someone else, and it's fun. So you're more likely to do it over the long term. But also it's fast movements as well. One of the things that I've become really interested in, and I wonder, Nick, if you wanted to build upon this as well, is this concept of motor unit training. So I've kind of only recently discovered this line of thinking where as we get older, basically the connections from our brain to our muscles, it starts to break down. And one of the ways that we can prevent that decline from happening is by doing so. It's called one rep max training, or trying to do fast movements, so powerful movements and quick movements, and that's there to try and stimulate all of our neurons to activate the muscles that that we need. And I think that's quite a powerful concept because there's a difference between someone who's older can still be quite strong, but they can also be at high risk of falls. And that's because if yes, you might be strong, you might be able to pull something at a slow movement, but if you suddenly trip, then you need to be able to quickly activate your muscles so that you can catch yourself and not fall. And so that's an area that I've only sort of started to scratch the surface on in terms of this, yeah, concept of motor unit training. And I just wanted to, yeah, see, particularly Nick, if you've sort of come across this concept and, yeah, what your initial thoughts are.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So you're talking about power versus strength, which is not something that a lot of people really consider. They think about, okay, how much can I lift on a bar or how much can I do in general? And that's extremely important. There's no poo-pooing that, but what we should also focus on is how quickly you can achieve that strength. How quickly can you reach that strength? And this happens within milliseconds. And you're talking about like motor unit training. So with power, I don't remember the exact age that it starts to decline, but it's quite early. I think it's like 40s or 50s or something like that. So it's not noticeable when you're, let's say, in your 50s, but it definitely comes to a pretty precipitous drop when you get into your 60s and 70s and beyond. And to your point, one of the most dangerous things that affects, well, longevity, health span, everything related to health is falls, right? So if you end up in the hospital because you've got a broken hip or whatever it might be, broken knee, whatever it might be. So to prevent that, your musculature has to be able to activate at a quick enough speed to move your leg in position to stop you from falling and experiencing that damage, that structural damage. So one way that people can do that, exactly to your point, Brad, is you can train at a much lower percentage of what's known as your one rep max. So you mentioned one rep max, and that's you can train for strength, you can train to lift an overall amount of weight or amount of resistance. And you can get really good at that. But another way to train is to actually undercut that and use maybe like 50% of one's one rep max. So the maximum achievable strength that they can achieve and then try to move that weight as fast as possible instead of just trying to move the weight. You know that you can move the weight because it's only 50% of your one rep max, but can you move it as quickly as possible? And that starts to train those motor units. So if we dive into the motor units just for a minute, I don't want to bog this down with too much physiology, but for those people that are interested, so what Brad's talking about, this motor unit, is you have this neuron. So you have a nerve cell that extends down to your musculature, and the musculature is made up of these cells, these muscle cells. And they don't actually touch with one another, but they hover right above one another. So you've got this one neuron that extends out to many different muscle cells. And as we age, as that power starts to decline, you start to have this release. It's like a nasty divorce that happens between the neurons and the muscle cells to the point where the neuron is not as close to the muscle cell anymore. And that happens because you don't have this coaxing, this engagement by these molecules that are released by the muscle cell to coax the neuron to its location hovering right above the muscle cell. And one way that we can fight against that is through this power training, through this, using not super light weights, but relatively light weights. And there's other ways of training this as well. But one way, especially for older individuals, is to use lighter weights and try to move it with purpose and with more speed than how you would normally train it. So really try to push yourself against it. And that allows for those molecules that end up engaging with those neurons to allow to have that coaxing of the neurons back to the musculature. And there's a ton of research that really shows that even in 90-year-olds, you can have these tremendous reversal in power. I'm not saying that you're going to return back to your 20s or anything, but you can have a really, really tremendous effect. So I'm glad you brought it up because that's I would say in the resistance training world, it's probably, I would say, at least 50% of the equation when it comes to aging.
I wanted to bring it up because I think a lot of people don't see the difference or aren't necessarily aware of the importance between power and strength. And to pick up on your point about hip fractures, so when I was an orthopedic resident in 2019, I was actually assisting in in fixing people's broken hips. And one of the startling statistics at the time, I'm not too sure if it's changed, but I don't think it has, was that if a person has a hip fracture, they're 50%. They've got a 50% mortality rate over the next 1 year. So basically, half of the people that we were operating on, they would be dead within a year. And that's a really startling statistic. And that's why I'm particularly interested in what we can do now, and also anything that we can do to prevent falls. It's so critical for our long-term health.
Yeah, I was just going to add some concrete evidence on the falls because I found a number of studies researching for this that kind of blew my mind because we all know exercise is important, but the level of evidence that I found and kind of how striking it is, I didn't even know existed. So for falls, there are actual meta-analyses of randomized trials showing that exercise reduces the number of falls in people over 60 years old. So resistance training and things like balance training. This I think can be more motivating because one thing is just saying exercise is good for you, which can sound too abstract, but to know that if you're 60 or 70 and if you have some gait issues or some balance issues or some strength issues, and to know that by exercising you're actually going to be reducing your chance of falling and breaking bones, which, as you mentioned, can be a game changer in both directions. That's a much more actionable advantage there. Yeah, I found some amazing stuff. Meta-analyses of randomized trials looking at cancer survivors, randomized to exercise or not, reducing the risk of recurrence of cancer by 50%. Just insane. I mean, this is an insane result. You take people who survived cancer, who are in remission, and the risk of the cancer popping up again over the time of follow-up is cut in half by doing an exercise. Everybody's going through the standard of care of tumor follow-up, but post-cancer screenings and all that. But just assigning an exercise program reduces the risk of the cancer popping up again. Mortality reduced by 24% in this meta-analysis of randomized trials. Just insane. The strongest trial was actually, this is both in men and women. The strongest trial I found was actually breast cancer survivors. So they were all women post-surgery. It was a 45-minute workout daily, and they saw a twofold reduction. That's 50% reduction in all-cause mortality in that trial. So half the chance of dying by doing this workout. I mean, it's insane scale of benefits.
Yeah, it is remarkable. Actually, turning to that, disease states, I don't know if you guys want to speak a little bit on the effect that exercise has, for example, on like diabetes or Gilles, as you said, with cancer. I mean, that's a huge one. Heart disease. I mean, exercise and just having more lean mass in general, but certainly the effect that exercise has beyond lean mass. I mean, or I guess I should say beyond muscle mass. The effect that it has on your tendons, the effect that it has on your ligaments, the bones, everything. I mean, it combats osteoporosis. It combats, I mean, just every disease, just name it. Exercise will most likely have a tremendous impact on it. I mean, to varying degrees. Some diseases it has the most direct impact on. Another one you could say is sarcopenia. Well, the for those that are listening, sarcopenia is just when you have this loss of muscle, but also the function of that muscle. And that's probably actually the more important element. To Brad's point earlier about power, that loss of muscle function is incredibly dangerous, especially later in life, which is what we were talking about earlier. But the term for that is sarcopenia. So exercise can have tremendous impact on all those different disease states, and it does that through direct means. It affects your musculature. It changes the literal proteins and the functions of your muscle cells. It can affect your bone cells. It can affect your immune system, which I'm sure plays a huge factor in the cancer. I haven't actually looked at that research, but I would imagine that that definitely has to be a player. It affects your VO2. You were talking about VO2 earlier as well, testing that. And I think one of the main reasons why cardiorespiratory fitness, which is measured through VO2, which is directly linked to exercise, is such a potent metric, is because it does speak to all these different organ systems speaking or working so well together to indicate, oh, okay, yes, you are kind of in this latter half of individuals that have this protective effect, this protected effect from exercise. So, I mean, we could talk about exercise for hours and I mean days because it's just so extensive the research that's behind it.
One
Yeah.
thing I think would be quite useful, we've talked about sort of the beginning level about how can people start out with the exercise, talking about, things like exercise snacks and working up from there. But what about sort of more advanced methods? So say for all of us, like I'd be curious to know both of your workouts and why you've chosen particular workout strategies.
For me, I do resistance training about 3, 4 days a week. And I do cardio probably 4 or 5 days a week. Today I did like the rowing machine. Sometimes I'll just power walk or I'll do like a stationary bike or something like that. And then a couple of days I'll do stretching. So I'll do like a half an hour just stretching every muscle. And I found that that makes a huge difference as well because just doing the resistance training, I had a period where I was just lifting weights, but I was so stiff. Like I could, what's the point? You can lift weights, but then you can barely move. Like it kind of beats the purpose. So I made sure to introduce more cardio, more stretching. Some things they're just functional, recovering from areas of weakness. Like if I had an injury in the past, just working on a wrist or a knee that had a problem. So things more like thinking in terms of the long term, things thinking of function, thinking of mobility. I mean, when I was 25, I didn't think about any of none of this existed. I just wanted to get buff. But as you get a little older, you sort of get into your 40s and later, and you start to think about longevity. Like you want to keep your function, you want to aesthetics, sure, but above all, function. You want to be functional. You want to be able to move normally and feel good and be able to operate normally.
And so say with your resistance training, how do you kind of structure that? Like, do you push yourself to near failure, for example? How many sets or repetitions of a particular exercise do you try and do?
It's a kind of typical bro split. So I'll do each muscle group once a week, except legs. I try to do twice a week. And then I'll do maybe 10-ish sets of maybe 10, give or take 10 reps. And yeah, I'll try to go the first one or two. I'll do a couple of warm ups and then I'll do kind of increasing intensity. And by the end, 1 or 2 sets, I'll try to go either to failure or close to failure.
'Cause on the point of number of sets, so I remember, and I just want to make sure I get this right. So, one of the leading exercise scientists, his name is Professor Brad Schoenfeld, and he published a systematic review and meta-analysis. I think it was 1 or 2 years ago, and it basically gives a really nice summary about how to. How to maximize the benefits from your resistance training protocol. One of them was that the point of training to near failure. So for people who are listening, that basically just say if you're doing push-ups, failure is the point where you've done so many push-ups that you physically can't do another one. Um, but there are a couple of dangers about pushing yourself to that point because you do increase the chance of injuries. And if you have a look at, what gives you the greatest strength improvements, it seems that you can get basically the same strength improvements if you push yourself to 1 or 2 reps before you reach failure. And then in terms of the number of sets that you want to be doing per exercise per week, it seems that ideally you want to be striving for around about 10. You can probably do more sets per exercise than that, but again, you start to reach that point of diminishing returns. But yeah, Nick, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. 'Cause obviously, I think you've got a bit more experience in terms of the literature and research on exercise than both Jill and I. So yeah, what's your reading from the research about how many reps we should be doing, how many sets, and how to basically optimize your workout?
Yeah, you're exactly right about Dr. Schoenfeld. I've read a lot of his research in the past, and he's put out some excellent content on volume and frequency and intensity and all that stuff. And yeah, it would take a lot to distill that all down. But we'll just say from a health perspective, I think that I think that honestly focusing on just three high quality sets of compound exercises. So if you're talking about compound exercises, you're talking about the major muscle groups. So that would be your chest, your shoulders, your back, your abdominal, your legs, but you also want to do your posterior chain, so the back side of your legs as well as the front of your legs. And that will allow you to get the maximum health benefit that you would from exercise, from a resistance training standpoint, especially from people who, and you can certainly go up in sets from there. I mean, you're doing 3 sets, let's say, per session. And then let's say you were to just do 2 sessions per week. And then you could continue to go up from there. And exactly to your point, Brad, if you were to go up to about 10 sets, you get, we'll say, like 80% of the maximal muscle growth and muscle strength and whatnot. But there's evidence that you can go beyond that. But again, to your point, you were talking about going to failure can increase your risk of injury. Well, the same thing can happen when you fatigue your musculature just over an entire week. You're just continuously hammering it with more and more sets. So I think that for more advanced people, that's definitely feasible, and especially people that are younger, or maybe if you just give yourself more space, more time between different sessions. But for a person that's maybe an intermediate or just getting back into it, but doesn't necessarily have any like arthritis issues or whatever issues that they might have, then I would start at 3 sets of each exercise. So just pick one exercise that hits those compound movements. You can easily find it on Google. You're going to find, I mean, not everything is obviously going to be perfect, but if you just type in compound exercises for back, compound exercises for chest, you're definitely going to find plenty of exercises. You don't have to worry about like, well, which one is optimal or anything. Just as long as it's considered a compound exercise, that by definition means that it's affecting multiple muscle groups at the same time. So I wouldn't worry about those specifics too much. And so I guess to break things down, we've just covered, let's say, frequency for somebody who's, wanting to have a little bit more stimulation than just, let's say, going for a walk or doing just a little bit of at-home work. What they can do is go twice a week and then increase that up to 3 times a week, and they can continue to increase that as however they feel. The other variable is to look at intensity. So intensity is just the amount of resistance that you're moving in your exercise routine. So let's say if you were to do a chest press, if you were to do some sort of barbell bench press or whatever, and I'm just using that as an example, but you can switch in any exercise that we've been kind of alluding to. So intensity, so 100% is the 1 rep max that we've been talking about. Now, that's obviously not feasible for a lot of people that are just, kind of dabbling in this. So they should probably start with something, kind of an estimate of a 1 rep max, or they can try to do something like they've got these different calculators that you can use. They're not perfect. I mean, by any means, they're not perfect, but they'll at least give you a ballpark. And then you're going to end up using a percentage or an intensity that's much lower than what that estimate is. So, an intensity that works would be something for an older individual that has maybe some knee problems, maybe some elbow problems. I would probably opt for something like 60% intensity of their 1 rep max. So you're going pretty low on weight, and then you're just going to increase to compensate for that. You can just increase the number of repetitions that you do. And then for a person who maybe wants to go a little bit higher intensity, they can go up to like 80% and then drop the number of repetitions. The point being that both of those modalities will ultimately lead to similar results on muscle growth, some effect on muscle strength. They're not exactly going to be identical on muscle strength, but again, we're not talking about optimizing everything for like a power lift or anything like that. In that situation, you start getting into like undulating periodization programs and just like stuff that's way beyond the scope of, somebody who's just trying to get healthier. And the third category, so we've covered frequency, we've covered intensity, and now the third one is volume. So the amount of work, the amount of stimulation that you apply to your musculature. And I usually use a week. So just look at your entire week and see, am I improving across the week? Am I increasing the load? So that can be, you can manipulate intensity, or you can manipulate the frequency that you go to the gym, or you can just add another set to your exercise routine, for example. There's a lot of different ways that you can manipulate the overall amount of work that you do throughout the week. So if you start out with 2 times a week, if we go back to our example, you do a chest press at 60% intensity and you do it for, let's say, 12 repetitions. Then what you would do, so to calculate that, is you just take that number, 60%, you would actually have like a weight that you would apply to that, and then you just multiply that by 12, and then that gives you the volume for that session, for that particular session. And you do that over the week. And if, let's say, 1 week after another week, it's slowly incrementally increasing, you can do that any number of different ways, then that means you're making progress. And that's really all that matters. If you're making progress, then your body has to adapt to that. And if it's adapting to that, you're getting increases in all the benefits that we talked about. Like I said, there's a whole lot more that could be said on the topic, but I don't want to monopolize the whole conversation around it.
Well, I think you've touched on a really important point there, Nick, which is the concept of progressive overload. And I think so. Say, for example, patients that I see at the clinic who are, doing gardening or doing walking, um, which is wonderful. One of the things that I do speak with them about is this concept of progressive overload. That ideally we want to be trying to push the body so that it can, ideally halt the decline and even reverse some of the decline. That age-associated decline that I'm referring to. Um, yeah, and I think it's quite nice as well, Gil. You're talking about challenging yourself and seeing, say for example, you being able to walk faster or lift heavier weights, and it is quite an addictive process where you're starting to level up in terms of your health.
Are we just kind of see if we can summarize the exercise? Are we all in agreement that ideally having some form of cardiometabolic, like aerobic exercise, and some form of resistance training combined is ideal? And are we all in agreement also that resistance training, this myth that we have that resistance training is for young people and for men who want to get buff is pretty much nonsense, and virtually everyone can and should be doing resistance training, and older people, women, often these groups that are not as emphasized can benefit as much, if not more, from this.
100%.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a good kind of a summation if people got lost in the details.